The lessons of power are written in blood and betrayal across the pages of history. 5 centuries after Niccolò Machiavelli penned his observations on human nature and political survival, his insights remain as sharp as a Florentine blade. In the corridors of Renaissance palaces and modern corporate boardrooms alike, the same fundamental truth echoes: not all people deserve your help, and some will use your generosity as a weapon against you. This document examines 6 archetypes of individuals who, according to Machiavellian wisdom, represent clear and present dangers to those foolish enough to extend aid without proper consideration. These are not merely difficult people or challenging personalities, they are power vampires who will systematically drain your resources, influence, and strength until you find yourself weakened, compromised, and possibly destroyed. Understanding these dangerous archetypes is not about becoming callous or abandoning all human compassion. Rather, it is about developing the political intelligence necessary to distinguish between worthy recipients of your assistance and those who would exploit your good nature for their own advancement. In a world where power dynamics govern everything from personal relationships to international diplomacy, such wisdom becomes essential for survival and success. Part 1: The Philosophical Foundation of Strategic Restraint. The young merchant Lorenzo stood before the mirror in his Venetian palazzo, adjusting the silk doublet that marked his rising status in the city's complex hierarchy of trade and politics. At 32, he had built a modest fortune through careful investments and strategic alliances, but tonight's dinner would test everything Machiavelli had taught him about the dangerous generosity of the powerful. His guest was to be Giuliano, a man whose reputation for charm equaled only his talent for destroying those who helped him. 6 months earlier, Giuliano had approached Lorenzo with a tale of temporary financial difficulties, promising substantial returns on a small loan that would help him regain his footing in the spice trade. The story was compelling, the potential profits attractive, and Giuliano's connections to influential families seemed to make the arrangement beneficial for both parties. Yet something in Giuliano's manner had triggered Lorenzo's memory of a passage from The Prince: "Men are so simple and so ready to obey present necessities that one who deceives will always find those who allow themselves to be deceived." The question was not whether Giuliano's need was genuine, it almost certainly was. The question was whether helping him would serve Lorenzo's interests or merely transfer Lorenzo's power into the hands of someone who would use it against him. This fundamental principle underlies all Machiavellian thinking about assistance and generosity. Help is not morally neutral, it is a transfer of power, resources, and influence from one party to another. Every act of assistance creates a relationship of obligation, expectation, and dependency that can be exploited by those who understand its dynamics. The wise leader, therefore, does not ask whether someone deserves help, but whether providing that help serves their own strategic interests and long-term survival. The first dangerous archetype emerges from this analysis: the habitual victim. This individual has mastered the art of presenting their failures, misfortunes, and poor decisions as external circumstances beyond their control. They approach potential helpers with well-rehearsed narratives of injustice, bad luck, and systematic disadvantage that appeal to both sympathy and the helper's desire to be seen as generous and powerful. Giuliano exemplified this pattern perfectly. As Lorenzo had discovered through discreet inquiries, his guest had a 15-year history of approaching successful merchants with similar requests for assistance. Each time, the story varied slightly. Sometimes it was a delayed payment from a major client, sometimes unexpected customs fees, sometimes a family emergency, but the underlying structure remained constant. Giuliano positioned himself as a victim of circumstances while carefully concealing his role in creating those circumstances through poor planning, excessive risk-taking, and previous betrayals of trust. The danger of helping habitual victims extends beyond the immediate loss of resources. These individuals rarely learn from their mistakes because they have externalized responsibility for their failures. Consequently, helping them does not solve their problems but merely provides temporary relief that allows them to continue their destructive patterns. Worse, success in obtaining help from one source validates their approach and encourages them to seek additional assistance from others, often using the previous help as evidence of their worthiness. More insidiously, habitual victims often develop a sense of entitlement to continued assistance. Having successfully portrayed themselves as deserving help once, they expect ongoing support and become resentful when it is not forthcoming. This resentment can transform into active hostility, as the former victim now views their previous benefactor as someone who has abandoned them in their time of need. The helper, having invested resources and reputation in the relationship, finds themselves in the impossible position of either continuing to provide support to someone who shows no signs of improvement, or cutting off assistance and creating an enemy who knows their weaknesses and vulnerabilities. Lorenzo had witnessed this dynamic firsthand when his mentor, the respected banker Marco Benedetti, had made the mistake of helping a young nobleman named Alessandro who claimed to need funds to complete a lucrative trade mission to Constantinople. The initial loan had been repaid on schedule, encouraging Marco to provide additional support when Alessandro returned with stories of expanded opportunities requiring greater investment. Over 3 years, Marco had advanced increasingly large sums, each time believing that this final infusion of capital would establish Alessandro's independence and generate substantial returns. The inevitable collapse came when Alessandro's elaborate schemes unraveled, revealing a pattern of deception, poor judgment, and fundamental misunderstanding of basic commercial principles. Not only did Marco lose the entirety of his investment, but Alessandro had used Marco's name and reputation to secure additional credit from other sources, leaving Marco partially liable for debts he had never directly incurred. Worse still, Alessandro blamed Marco for the failure, claiming that insufficient support and unrealistic expectations had undermined what would otherwise have been a successful venture. The second dangerous archetype, closely related to the first but distinct in its methods, is the chronic excuse-maker. While habitual victims focus on external circumstances, chronic excuse-makers specialize in creating elaborate justifications for their failures that shift responsibility while maintaining the appearance of accountability. They acknowledge that things have gone wrong but always identify factors beyond their control that prevented success. These individuals are particularly dangerous because they often possess genuine skills and intelligence, making their explanations plausible and their future prospects seemingly viable. Unlike the obviously dysfunctional habitual victim, the chronic excuse-maker presents as competent and self-aware, someone who has simply encountered an unusual series of obstacles that prevented them from achieving their clearly attainable goals. Lorenzo had encountered such a person in the form of his cousin Roberto, a talented artist whose work showed genuine promise but whose career had been marked by a series of near successes that somehow always fell short of completion. Roberto's explanations were invariably sophisticated and partially true. A patron had unexpectedly died just before commissioning a major work, political upheaval had disrupted the art market, a rival had spread malicious rumors that undermined his reputation, changing fashions had reduced demand for his particular style. Each explanation contained enough truth to be believable, and Roberto's evident talent suggested that with just a small amount of support, he could overcome these temporary setbacks and achieve the success that his abilities merited. Lorenzo had initially provided modest assistance, introductions to potential patrons, small loans to purchase materials, even commissioning a piece for his own collection, all with the expectation that Roberto would use these opportunities to establish himself independently. The pattern that emerged, however, revealed the fundamental character flaw that made Roberto a dangerous recipient of help. Each opportunity provided led to new excuses for why it had not resulted in lasting success. The patron Lorenzo had introduced preferred a different style than Roberto was willing to adapt to. The materials purchased with Lorenzo's loan had been of inferior quality, sabotaging the final work. The commission Lorenzo had provided had been too small to serve as an effective demonstration of Roberto's capabilities. More troubling still, Roberto had begun to treat Lorenzo's assistance not as generous support but as an obligation that Lorenzo owed to family and artistic excellence. When Lorenzo eventually declined to provide additional help, Roberto's response revealed the true nature of the chronic excuse-maker's psychology. Rather than accepting responsibility for his failures or expressing gratitude for the assistance he had received, Roberto accused Lorenzo of abandoning him just as he was on the verge of a breakthrough, of failing to understand the challenges faced by serious artists, and of prioritizing crude commercial concerns over cultural achievement. The chronic excuse-maker's fundamental dishonesty lies not in their specific claims, which may be individually accurate, but in their refusal to acknowledge their own role in creating the patterns that require repeated assistance. They have developed sophisticated mental frameworks that allow them to maintain a positive self-image while systematically failing to achieve independence. Helping such individuals is not merely futile but actively harmful, as it reinforces their delusion that external support can substitute for the internal changes necessary for genuine success. The third archetype represents perhaps the most intellectually dangerous category, the ideological manipulator. These individuals have mastered the art of framing their personal needs in terms of larger causes, principles, or movements that their potential helpers are known to support. Rather than requesting assistance for personal gain, they position themselves as representatives of important ideas who deserve support because helping them advances the helper's own stated values and commitments. Lorenzo had observed this phenomenon in the person of Father Giuseppe, a charismatic priest who had approached several wealthy merchants with requests for support to establish a new charitable foundation dedicated to helping the poor. Father Giuseppe's presentations were masterful combinations of religious devotion, social consciousness, and practical planning that appealed simultaneously to his audience's spiritual concerns, desire for social recognition, and business instincts. The foundation's proposed structure would allow donors to gain both earthly and heavenly rewards. Their names would be prominently associated with good works that enhanced their reputations in the community, while their souls would benefit from the spiritual merits of charitable giving. Father Giuseppe himself would manage the day-to-day operations, using his theological training and pastoral experience to ensure that resources were allocated effectively and in accordance with Christian principles. The appeal was nearly irresistible, combining multiple powerful motivations in a package that seemed to offer only benefits with no apparent risks. Lorenzo's fellow merchants had been uniformly impressed by Father Giuseppe's knowledge, sincerity, and vision, and several had made substantial commitments to support the foundation's establishment and ongoing operations. Lorenzo's skepticism had been triggered not by any obvious flaw in Father Giuseppe's presentation but by its very perfection. The priest seemed to understand his audience's motivations with an insight that went beyond normal pastoral concern, crafting his appeals with a precision that suggested extensive experience in manipulation rather than genuine spiritual calling. More concerning still, Father Giuseppe's knowledge of each potential donor's specific interests, financial capacity, and personal vulnerabilities was remarkably detailed for someone who claimed to have recently arrived in Venice from a rural monastery. Discreet investigation had revealed Father Giuseppe's true nature. Far from being a simple man of God seeking support for charitable work, he was a sophisticated operator who had perfected the technique of identifying wealthy individuals' ideological commitments and, then, presenting himself as the perfect vehicle for expressing those commitments through concrete action. His background included a series of failed ventures in other cities, each time involving religious or charitable foundations that had somehow never achieved their stated objectives while providing Father Giuseppe with a comfortable living and valuable connections to influential families. The ideological manipulator's particular danger lies in their ability to make refusal of assistance appear to be a betrayal of the potential helper's own stated principles. By positioning themselves as representatives of causes their targets supposedly support, they create psychological pressure that makes rational evaluation of their true worthiness difficult. Refusing to help Father Giuseppe could be portrayed as religious hypocrisy, lack of concern for the poor, or simple selfishness, characterizations that most successful merchants would find personally and professionally damaging. This dynamic explains why ideological manipulators are often successful in obtaining initial support even from otherwise shrewd and careful individuals. The psychological pressure to live up to one's stated values creates a vulnerability that skilled manipulators can exploit with devastating effectiveness. Once the initial commitment has been made, the manipulator can leverage the helper's investment and reputation to secure additional support, using the logic that abandoning the project now would make the initial assistance appear foolish and wasteful. Part 2. The sophisticated predators. The morning sun cast long shadows across the trading floor as Lorenzo reviewed the reports from his various commercial ventures. 3 months had passed since his decision to decline Giuliano's request for assistance, and the wisdom of that choice had become increasingly apparent. Through careful observation and discreet inquiries, Lorenzo had identified 3 additional archetypes of dangerous individuals whose methods were more sophisticated and, therefore, more threatening than the relatively obvious manipulations of habitual victims, chronic excuse-makers, and ideological manipulators. The 4th archetype had revealed itself in the person of Signora Caterina Medici, not a member of the famous Florentine family, but a woman who had deliberately chosen to use their name to enhance her apparent status and credibility. Signora Caterina represented what Lorenzo had come to understand as the flattering parasite, an individual whose primary skill lay in making powerful people feel important, intelligent, and virtuous while gradually extracting resources and influence from them. Signora Caterina's approach was masterful in its subtlety. Rather than requesting direct assistance, she would arrange seemingly coincidental encounters with her targets, during which she would demonstrate remarkable knowledge of their achievements, interests, and opinions. Her conversations never felt like attempts at manipulation because she appeared to seek nothing more than the pleasure of intelligent discussion with someone she genuinely admired and respected. Lorenzo had first encountered her at a reception hosted by the Venetian Merchants Guild, where she had approached him with specific questions about his recent success in establishing new trade routes to the eastern Mediterranean. Her knowledge was impressive. She understood not only the basic facts of his achievement but the subtle political and commercial challenges he had overcome to make the routes profitable. More importantly, she seemed to grasp the innovative aspects of his approach that other merchants had failed to appreciate. The conversation had been intellectually stimulating and personally gratifying in a way that Lorenzo rarely experienced. Most people who sought his attention were interested primarily in what he could do for them, while Signora Caterina seemed genuinely fascinated by how he thought and what motivated his decision-making. Her questions revealed an understanding of commercial strategy that suggested she might be a valuable advisor or even partner in future ventures. This initial interaction established a pattern that Lorenzo later recognized as characteristic of the flattering parasite. Signora Caterina would appear at social events where she knew Lorenzo would be present, always with new insights about his business activities or interesting observations about commercial opportunities she had noticed. She never asked for anything directly, but gradually their conversations began to include subtle suggestions about ways Lorenzo might expand his influence or improve his strategies. The danger of the flattering parasite lies not in crude attempts to extract resources but in their ability to make themselves seem indispensable to their target's continued success. Signora Caterina positioned herself as an unofficial advisor whose understanding of Lorenzo's goals and capabilities made her uniquely valuable as a sounding board for new ideas and a source of useful intelligence about competitors and opportunities. As their relationship developed, Signora Caterina began to mention her own projects and interests, always in the context of how they related to Lorenzo's activities rather than as requests for support. She explained, working to establish a network of information sources throughout the Mediterranean that would provide advance warning of political developments affecting trade routes. Such a network would obviously be valuable to someone in Lorenzo's position, and she believed that his success and reputation made him the ideal person to appreciate its potential. The gradual escalation was so smooth that Lorenzo almost failed to notice when Signora Caterina's hints and suggestions transformed into specific requests for assistance. The information network required funding to establish contacts and maintain communications. Lorenzo's introductions to certain political figures would help establish the network's credibility. His participation in the project would ensure its success while providing him with invaluable competitive advantages. Each request was framed not as a favor to Signora Caterina but as an opportunity for Lorenzo to enhance his own position. The assistance she sought was minimal compared to the benefits he would receive, and her evident understanding of his business made her seem like a natural partner rather than a supplicant. By the time Lorenzo realized the true nature of their relationship, Signora Caterina had positioned herself as an integral part of his commercial operations while contributing nothing tangible to their success. The recognition came when Lorenzo discovered that Signora Caterina had been approaching other wealthy merchants with similar proposals, using variations of the same network concept to extract funding and introductions from multiple sources. Her remarkable knowledge of commercial affairs came not from genuine expertise but from systematically gathering intelligence from her various targets and then redistributing it in ways that made each person feel uniquely informed and appreciated. More damaging still, Signora Caterina had been using Lorenzo's name and reputation to enhance her credibility with other potential targets, implying a closer business relationship than actually existed and leveraging his success to gain access to increasingly influential circles. The information network she claimed to be building existed primarily as a fiction that justified her continued access to wealthy and powerful individuals who might provide resources and opportunities. The flattering parasite's particular threat stems from their ability to exploit the isolation and ego needs that often accompany power and success. Wealthy and influential individuals frequently find themselves surrounded by people who want something from them, making genuine appreciation and intelligent conversation rare commodities. The flattering parasite provides these scarce social goods while gradually extracting payment in the form of resources, access, and reputation. The fifth archetype emerged from Lorenzo's analysis of a more dangerous category of manipulator, the emotional blackmailer. Unlike the flattering parasite's subtle approach, the emotional blackmailer uses psychological pressure and manipulation of guilt to extract assistance from their targets. These individuals are skilled at identifying and exploiting their target's emotional vulnerabilities, moral commitments, and psychological needs. Lorenzo had encountered this type in the person of his former business partner's widow, Signora Elena Rossi. When her husband Marco had died unexpectedly, leaving her with substantial debts and limited income, Lorenzo had naturally felt obligated to provide assistance both out of friendship for the deceased and concern for Elena's welfare. His initial support had been generous but carefully limited enough to ensure Elena's immediate security while she adjusted to her new circumstances and developed plans for long-term independence. Elena's response had initially seemed appropriate and grateful. She acknowledged Lorenzo's generosity, expressed understanding that his assistance was temporary, and claimed to be working diligently to establish her own means of support. However, as the agreed-upon timeframe for Lorenzo's help approached its end, Elena's communications began to take on a different character. Rather than demonstrating progress toward independence, Elena began to emphasize the difficulties she faced and the inadequacy of her current resources to address them. Her requests for continued assistance were accompanied by increasingly sophisticated emotional manipulation designed to make Lorenzo feel responsible for her welfare and guilty about the prospect of withdrawing his support. Elena's technique involved weaving together multiple psychological pressure points in ways that made rational evaluation of her requests extremely difficult. She would remind Lorenzo of her late husband's friendship and loyalty, suggesting that Marco would have expected Lorenzo to take care of his widow indefinitely. She would reference Lorenzo's reputation for generosity and moral character, implying that abandoning her would be inconsistent with the values he was known to espouse. Most effectively, she would describe the specific hardships she would face if his assistance ended, creating vivid mental images of suffering that would result from his decision to prioritize his own interests over her desperate needs. The emotional blackmailer's arsenal includes sophisticated understanding of their target's psychology and moral framework. Elena had studied Lorenzo carefully during their previous interactions, identifying his sensitivity to accusations of selfishness, his pride in being seen as honorable and generous, and his discomfort with the idea that his actions might cause suffering to vulnerable individuals. Her appeals were calibrated to exploit these specific vulnerabilities while making her continued dependence appear to be the result of circumstances beyond anyone's control rather than her own choices and limitations. Elena's narrative positioned Lorenzo not as a benefactor providing voluntary assistance but as someone with moral obligations that transcended normal commercial and social relationships. The emotional manipulation extended beyond simple guilt to include subtle threats about the consequences of withdrawing support. Elena would mention mutual acquaintances who she was sure would be disappointed to learn that Lorenzo had abandoned Marco's widow in her time of need. She would reference her own emotional fragility and health concerns, implying that the stress of financial insecurity might have serious consequences for which Lorenzo would bear some responsibility. Most insidiously, Elena began to reframe their relationship in ways that made Lorenzo's assistance appear to be payment for services or compensation for past benefits rather than charitable giving. She would remind him of occasions when she had provided social support or business intelligence that had been valuable to his operations, suggesting that his current assistance was simply reciprocating previous help rather than charity that he could legitimately discontinue. The emotional blackmailer's success depends on their ability to transform normal feelings of compassion and responsibility into overwhelming psychological pressure that makes rational decision-making nearly impossible. Their targets find themselves trapped in relationships where withdrawing assistance feels morally wrong and emotionally unacceptable, even when the assistance is clearly not producing the intended results and may actually be preventing the supposed beneficiary from developing independence. The sixth and most dangerous archetype represents the ultimate evolution of manipulative behavior, the false friendship builder. These individuals specialize in creating elaborate illusions of genuine personal relationships that mask systematic exploitation of their target's resources, influence, and vulnerabilities. Unlike other manipulators who maintain some distance between their personal and professional interactions, false friendship builders deliberately blur these boundaries to create psychological bonds that make their targets reluctant to evaluate their behavior objectively. Lorenzo had identified this pattern through observing the relationship between his colleague Antonio Grimaldi and a man named Francesco Barbaro, who had gradually insinuated himself into Antonio's personal and professional life over the course of 2 years. Francesco's approach had been remarkably sophisticated, beginning with genuine shared interests and compatible personalities that formed the foundation for what appeared to be an authentic friendship. Francesco had first met Antonio at a cultural salon where both men had demonstrated extensive knowledge of classical literature and contemporary artistic developments. Their initial conversations had been intellectually stimulating and personally satisfying, leading to additional meetings that seemed to arise naturally from their mutual interests and compatible social backgrounds. As their relationship developed, Francesco had proven to be an ideal friend, supportive during difficult periods, intellectually challenging during debates, socially engaging during public events, and personally loyal during conflicts with others. He seemed to understand Antonio's personality and needs with unusual clarity, providing exactly the kind of companionship and support that enhanced Antonio's life and work. The friendship's apparent authenticity was reinforced by Francesco's behavior in situations where crude opportunists would have revealed their true motivations. When Antonio offered assistance with business ventures or social introductions, Francesco would often decline or suggest alternatives that seemed more appropriate or beneficial to Antonio. He appeared to prioritize their friendship over potential advantages, demonstrating the kind of integrity and selflessness that characterize genuine personal relationships. This foundation of apparent authenticity allowed Francesco to gradually expand his influence over Antonio's decision-making without triggering suspicion or resistance. His advice was sought and followed because it came from a trusted friend who had demonstrated good judgment and genuine concern for Antonio's welfare. His introductions were valued because they came with implicit endorsements from someone whose opinion Antonio respected. The manipulation revealed itself slowly through patterns that became visible only through careful observation over extended periods. Francesco's advice, while individually reasonable, consistently guided Antonio toward decisions that increased Francesco's own influence and opportunities while limiting Antonio's independence and alternative relationships. His social introductions created networks centered around Francesco rather than Antonio, making Antonio increasingly dependent on Francesco's continued goodwill to maintain his social and professional connections. More subtly, Francesco had begun to shape Antonio's understanding of their relationship in ways that created obligations and expectations extending far beyond normal friendship. He would remind Antonio of specific instances when his advice or assistance had been particularly valuable, creating a sense of debt that justified increasingly significant requests for reciprocal support. He would reference their shared experiences and mutual trust as foundations for business partnerships and joint ventures that gave Francesco access to Antonio's resources and reputation. The false friendship builder's ultimate goal is not simply to extract resources or opportunities from their target but to establish a permanent position of influence that provides ongoing access to whatever benefits the relationship might yield. Francesco was not interested in a single favor or even a series of favors. He was systematically positioning himself as an integral part of Antonio's life whose removal would cause significant personal and professional disruption. This strategy makes false friendship builders particularly dangerous because their targets develop genuine emotional attachments that make objective evaluation extremely difficult. Antonio had come to depend on Francesco not only for practical assistance and social connections but for emotional support and intellectual companionship that seemed irreplaceable. The prospect of ending their relationship appeared to threaten not only the loss of specific benefits but the destruction of a valued friendship that had become central to Antonio's personal satisfaction and professional success. Part 3, The Strategic Response and Long-Term Consequences. The winter months brought a clarity to Lorenzo's understanding that the warm seasons had obscured. Sitting in his study while snow fell silently outside, he reviewed the documents and correspondence that tracked his interactions with the 6 archetypes over the past year. The patterns were unmistakable, and their implications extended far beyond his personal experience to the fundamental principles of power, influence, and survival that governed all human relationships. The decision to decline Giuliano's request for assistance had proven to be merely the beginning of a more comprehensive transformation in Lorenzo's approach to helping others. Each subsequent encounter with habitual victims, chronic excuse-makers, ideological manipulators, flattering parasites, emotional blackmailers, and false friendship builders had reinforced the essential truth that generosity without strategic thinking was not virtue but weakness that invited exploitation. The consequences of this recognition had been both liberating and sobering. Lorenzo's resources, previously dissipated across numerous requests for assistance that produced no lasting benefits for anyone involved, were now concentrated on carefully selected opportunities that served both humanitarian goals and strategic interests. His reputation, once vulnerable to manipulation by those who understood how to exploit his desire to be seen as generous and public-spirited, was now protected by systematic evaluation of potential recipients and clear boundaries around the assistance he was willing to provide. However, the implementation of Machiavellian principles in personal relationships had required navigating complex psychological and social challenges that pure political theory had not adequately addressed. The transition from intuitive generosity to strategic assistance had demanded not only intellectual understanding of manipulative patterns but emotional discipline to resist psychological pressures that had previously proven irresistible. The case of Signora Elena Rossi had provided the most difficult test of Lorenzo's new approach. Her escalating emotional manipulation had culminated in a direct confrontation when Lorenzo had informed her that his assistance would end according to their original agreement. Elena's response had revealed the full arsenal of techniques employed by skilled emotional blackmailers, including threats to damage his reputation, appeals to mutual friends who might pressure him to continue his support, and dramatic presentations of the suffering that would result from his decision. Lorenzo's resolution had required recognizing that Elena's welfare was not actually his responsibility, despite her sophisticated efforts to make him feel otherwise. The friendship and business partnership with her late husband had created no obligations extending beyond reasonable assistance during the transition period following Marco's death. Elena's inability or unwillingness to achieve independence was not a failure of Lorenzo's generosity but a consequence of her own choices and character limitations. More importantly, continued assistance would not actually serve Elena's interests, regardless of her claims to the contrary. Her increasing dependence on Lorenzo's support was preventing her from developing the skills and relationships necessary for long-term survival, while the emotional manipulation she employed was corrupting whatever genuine friendship might have existed between them. Lorenzo's withdrawal of support, though painful in the short term, created pressure for Elena to address her situation realistically rather than continuing to rely on increasingly desperate appeals for external rescue. The confrontation with Father Giuseppe had required different tactics but revealed similar principles. The ideological manipulator's strength lay in making refusal of assistance appear to contradict the potential helper's stated values and commitments. Lorenzo's response had involved reframing the situation to expose the contradiction between Father Giuseppe's claimed religious devotion and his actual behavior, which involved systematic deception and exploitation of charitable impulses. Rather than simply declining to provide support, Lorenzo had conducted a careful investigation of Father Giuseppe's background and previous activities, gathering evidence that could be presented to other potential targets who might be considering assistance. The revelation of Father Giuseppe's pattern of establishing failed charitable foundations while maintaining a comfortable personal lifestyle had effectively neutralized his ability to manipulate religious and humanitarian sentiments for personal gain. This proactive response reflected a crucial insight about dealing with sophisticated manipulators. Passive resistance was often insufficient to protect either oneself or the broader community from their depredations. Those who mastered the art of exploiting others' generosity represented ongoing threats that could only be addressed through active exposure of their methods and histories. The most complex challenge had emerged from Lorenzo's recognition of Francesco Barbaro's manipulation of Antonio Grimaldi. The false friendship builder's technique of creating genuine emotional bonds while systematically exploiting them presented ethical dilemmas that purely strategic analysis could not resolve. Antonio's attachment to Francesco was real, even though it was based on a fundamentally dishonest relationship, and destroying that attachment would cause genuine suffering regardless of its ultimate necessity. Lorenzo's approach had involved gradually providing Antonio with information that allowed him to recognize Francesco's manipulation without directly attacking their friendship. By sharing his own experiences with similar individuals and encouraging Antonio to evaluate Francesco's advice and assistance objectively, Lorenzo had created opportunities for Antonio to discover the patterns himself rather than having them imposed from outside. This indirect method had required patience and careful calibration to avoid triggering Antonio's defensive reactions while ensuring that the manipulation was exposed before it could cause irreparable damage. The success of this approach had depended on Antonio's fundamental intelligence and integrity, qualities that made him vulnerable to Francesco's deception but also capable of recognizing it once the patterns became visible. The broader implications of these experiences extended beyond personal relationships to fundamental questions about the nature of power and responsibility in human societies. Machiavelli's insight that effective leadership required understanding and responding to human nature as it actually existed rather than as one wished it to be had proven applicable not only to political governance but to all relationships involving disparities in resources, influence, or capability. The 6 archetypes represented different aspects of a universal tendency to exploit others' generosity and goodwill for personal advantage. Their existence was not an aberration or failure of social systems but a predictable consequence of human nature operating under conditions of scarcity and competition. Understanding their methods and motivations was therefore essential for anyone who sought to exercise power responsibly while protecting themselves from systematic exploitation. However, this understanding carried with it the obligation to use such knowledge ethically and constructively. The ability to identify and resist manipulation could be employed either to create more effective and sustainable forms of assistance or to justify callousness and selfishness that served no legitimate purpose. The difference lay in maintaining focus on long-term consequences and genuine human welfare rather than short-term convenience or personal advantage. Lorenzo's year of applying Machiavellian principles had ultimately increased rather than decreased his ability to help others effectively. By concentrating his resources on individuals whose circumstances, character, and goals made success probable, he had been able to provide assistance that actually solved problems rather than merely prolonging them. By protecting himself from systematic exploitation, he had preserved the wealth and influence necessary to continue providing such assistance over time. The recipients of his more carefully targeted help had included genuine entrepreneurs whose businesses faced temporary difficulties that modest investment could resolve, skilled artisans whose talents required only introductions and initial commissions to flourish, and promising young people whose education and training needed financial support during crucial developmental periods. In each case, the assistance provided had generated lasting improvements in the recipient's circumstances while creating relationships characterized by mutual respect and reciprocal benefit rather than dependence and manipulation. The contrast with his previous approach was striking. The resources previously dissipated among habitual victims who never achieved independence, chronic excuse-makers who never accepted responsibility, and various forms of manipulators who exploited his generosity had accomplished nothing positive for anyone involved. The supposed beneficiaries had not been helped but rather enabled in destructive patterns that prevented genuine progress, while Lorenzo's capacity to provide meaningful assistance had been systematically undermined. This pattern reflected a broader truth about the relationship between individual virtue and social effectiveness that Machiavelli had understood but that contemporary thinking often obscured. Good intentions were not sufficient to produce good results, and actions taken without consideration of their actual consequences could cause more harm than benefit regardless of the moral motivations behind them. The application of strategic thinking to charitable giving and personal assistance was not a betrayal of humanitarian values but their more sophisticated expression. True compassion required understanding the difference between help that enabled genuine improvement and supposed assistance that merely perpetuated problems while making the helper feel virtuous and generous. As winter deepened and Lorenzo planned his activities for the coming year, he reflected on how this transformation in his approach to helping others had affected his understanding of leadership more generally. The prince who sought to govern effectively faced essentially the same challenge as the individual who sought to assist others wisely, identifying which appeals for support reflected genuine need and legitimate opportunity versus systematic attempts at manipulation and exploitation. The techniques employed by the 6 archetypes in personal relationships had direct parallels in political contexts where advisors, petitioners, and supplicants used similar methods to extract resources and concessions from those in positions of authority. The habitual victim became the perpetually rebellious province that blamed its problems on external interference rather than internal dysfunction. The chronic excuse-maker became the incompetent official who could always identify external factors responsible for policy failures. The ideological manipulator became the faction leader who wrapped personal ambitions in appeals to principle and popular welfare. The flattering parasite became the court advisor who told the prince what he wanted to hear while pursuing their own agenda through access to privileged information and royal favor. The emotional blackmailer became the ally who demanded continued support by threatening to reveal embarrassing secrets or withdraw cooperation at crucial moments. The false friendship builder became the ambitious subordinate who cultivated personal relationships with the prince while systematically undermining his independence and decision-making capacity. Recognition of these patterns had profound implications for anyone seeking to exercise power effectively and responsibly. The traditional virtues of generosity, loyalty, and trust required sophisticated application that took into account the complex motivations and strategic thinking of those who sought to exploit them. Effective leadership demanded not the abandonment of moral principles but their intelligent implementation in ways that served their intended purposes rather than enabling their systematic subversion. The transformation had not been without costs. Lorenzo's reputation among certain circles had shifted from that of an easy mark for charitable appeals to a more complex figure whose generosity was disciplined by strategic thinking. Some individuals who had previously sought his assistance had been disappointed or offended by his more systematic approach to evaluating requests and setting conditions for support. However, these costs had been more than offset by gains in respect from those who understood the difference between weakness disguised as virtue and genuine strength applied to beneficial purposes. Lorenzo's business relationships had improved as partners recognized that his decision-making was based on careful analysis rather than emotional manipulation. His social position had become more secure as potential allies understood that association with him involved mutual benefit rather than one-sided exploitation. Most importantly, Lorenzo's capacity to identify and resist manipulation had increased his effectiveness in all areas of life where power dynamics operated. His negotiations with suppliers, customers, and competitors had become more successful as his understanding of psychological pressure and emotional manipulation allowed him to recognize and counter such tactics when directed against him. His political relationships had grown stronger as his reputation for principled but strategic behavior attracted allies who valued competence over mere compliance. The principles Machiavelli had articulated 5 centuries earlier remained as relevant as ever because human nature itself had not changed. The specific techniques employed by those who sought to exploit others' resources and goodwill had evolved with changing social and economic circumstances, but the underlying motivations and psychological dynamics remained constant. Understanding these dynamics was therefore not merely an academic exercise but a practical necessity for anyone who sought to navigate complex human relationships successfully. As Lorenzo prepared for the challenges and opportunities that the new year would bring, he carried with him the hard-won wisdom that true strength lay not in the capacity to give without consideration but in the ability to distinguish between those who deserved assistance and those who would exploit it. This distinction required not cynicism or callousness but rather a deeper understanding of human nature and a more sophisticated approach to implementing humanitarian values in a world where good intentions alone were insufficient to guarantee beneficial results. The 6 archetypes would continue to exist because they represented fundamental aspects of human behavior under conditions of scarcity and competition. However, their power to cause harm depended entirely on the willingness of their potential targets to ignore the lessons of history and experience in favor of comfortable illusions about human nature and the consequences of strategic generosity. Those who understood these lessons and applied them consistently would find themselves better equipped not only to protect their own interests but to use their resources and influence in ways that actually improved the world rather than merely satisfying their own psychological needs and social expectations. In the end, Machiavelli's greatest insight was not that human nature was fundamentally evil or that moral principles were irrelevant to effective action, but rather that the achievement of good results required sophisticated understanding of the complex motivations and strategic behaviors that characterized human relationships under all circumstances. This understanding remained as crucial for personal relationships as for political governance, and its application remained as necessary for individual survival as for social progress. The snow continued to fall outside Lorenzo's window as he closed his books and prepared for sleep, secure in the knowledge that his understanding of these principles would guide him through whatever challenges the future might bring. The 6 archetypes would undoubtedly appear again in new forms and with new techniques, but their fundamental nature would remain constant, and his ability to recognize and respond to them appropriately would determine both his own success and his capacity to contribute meaningfully to the welfare of others who deserved and could benefit from his assistance. The wisdom of centuries had been distilled into practical knowledge that could be applied immediately and continuously, transforming abstract philosophical insights into concrete tools for navigating the eternal complexities of human nature and social interaction. This transformation represented not the end of learning but its beginning, as each new encounter with the archetypes would provide additional opportunities to refine understanding and improve application of principles that would remain relevant as long as human beings continued to interact in relationships characterized by disparities in power, resources, and influence.